Welcome to the research track, the session on general gemology and jewelry. My name is Robert Weldon, and I'm the director of the Richard T. Livelihoods Library and Information Center here in Carlsbad. What a symposium it has been. Thank you. Because we're nearing the end of it, however, I'd like to invite you to please, when you have a chance, to visit the poster rooms. Those are the adjoining rooms that you have over here, if you haven't done so already, because there's a lot of additional information on those posters. Well, what an exciting program we have for you today. Between 1:30 and 3:30, we will focus on gemstones and the gem supply chain. That is, getting the gemstones to market. This is an increasingly critical juncture in our business because it touches on the area where gemology, sourcing, the environment, and humanity come together. This crossroads is one that everyone in the supply chain seeks to understand, including, perhaps most importantly, the last link in the chain, the consumer. Millennials, and I'm thinking about my daughter here, your children, and many of you in the audience actually, or your customers, they seek this knowledge because they want assurances that the supply chain is real, that it remains resilient, and that it remains sustainable. So we have an incredible roster of very talented speakers ready for you today, and they're going to be telling you about their true experiences in this field. Our keynote speaker for this event is Dr. Saleem Ali. He is a Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and Environment at the University of Delaware. He will present on gemstones and sustainable livelihoods, from mines to market. Please help me welcome Dr. Saleem Ali.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be back at GIA. I was reminiscing that the first time I visited GIA, our two boys were at the age where my wife had to take them to Legoland so I could have my meetings. So very conveniently, very family-friendly campus you have in that way. And happily now the older one is in college and the younger one is applying this semester. So it's amazing how time flies. GIA is a very special place, and it's great to see that over the past decade that I have been interacting with the organization, it is very resilient as well, as was noted in terms of, despite the changes in the market, the ups and downs of the financial world, the organization has withstood all that. And it is indeed an area of research that has been neglected in the community outside some of the core geoscience and gemology areas. So I feel very privileged that I've been able to bring some of your work to also the audiences in places which might not otherwise have thought about it. So thanks again to Dr. Shigley, Dr. Weldon, a lot of the colleagues here who have been very gracious in inviting me, keeping me in the loop about your activities. So what I'm going to try and do in the time allotted to me is to give you an overview, because we have a diverse audience. Some of it may seem rudimentary, so please bear with me. But I hope that there will be enough time for discussion, because with such a large audience, I really do want this to be a collective learning experience. So I've been given 35 minutes, but I'll try my best to finish a little earlier, and I would encourage you to please engage, keep your questions ready, be provocative, be as confrontational as possible. We're living in a political culture where that is celebrated, so please feel free to do so. My contact details are there in case you need to reach me by email or social media. and so on. And I also wanted to note the website, particularly that we have related to gemstones. So my research is around the extractive industries and development, and gemstones is part of my area of interest, but I work on other projects as well. So the one which is particularly relevant to this audience is this website, sustainablegemstones.org. Some of you may have already visited the site. This is the site of what was being called the Gem Hub. It's a grant we've received from Tiffany & Company Foundation over the last 2 years to establish this portal and a research and training program at the University of Delaware, but with partners all over the world. And with industry, we're very pleased to be partnering with AGTA, with many other organizations as well. So definitely keep that website on your favorite list in your browser and visit it often, provide us content. We would really welcome your participation in that. All right, so as the topic suggests, I'm going to try and give you this supply chain perspective on gemstones and sustainability, and how the changing times and the conversations around environmental and social aspects of sustainability particularly. We often say there are 3 legs to the stool of sustainability. There's economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. The economic side is, of course, often self-evident because that's in your face all the time, right? You hear it all, the balance sheets, and you've got to figure out that your business is profitable, though the Harvard people across were telling us about how Amazon was able to defy that in the morning, that for 20 years they were not profitable, but then became so later. So the economic sustainability also can be questioned, but the issue is more around the social and the environmental sustainability side in the context of this session. But I will try my best to also make the connections with the economic sustainability aspects as well. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to give you this panoramic perspective on how, coming from the environmental community, which is where I have my roots, is, my first degree was in chemistry, but I focused on environmental chemistry. And that's why I feel very comfortable when I'm seeing a lot of the earlier presentations, which are, talking about all these analytical techniques which chemists have used. But I moved quickly into this realm of how environmental social science professionals perceive consumerism. And I was especially interested in those kinds of consumer items which are often perceived as luxury, because those are the ones which are more difficult often to reconcile with the hardcore environmental ethos, so to speak. So there has been this pushback a lot in the environmental community around luxury goods. And you know that all too well. And so I start off with that and try to deconstruct that kind of an approach that some environmentalists often have. And one of my earlier books, which is when I first visited GIA, I think was when that book came out and I presented to your students, it was about this issue of wants versus needs. And it questioned environmental discourse about how we are so simplistic often in saying that there are some things which are essential and these are basic, needs of food and shelter, and there are others which are not so. And what I try to suggest is that there's an interconnection between them, because we live in a world where there is structural inequality, and often what you may consider to be a want may well be down the supply chain a need for someone else. And we know that all too well with gemstone supply chains. There is no way that Botswana could have risen out of abject poverty. They couldn't have done it by just having cattle ranching, which they did before, right? It was because they were able to transition into an economy where value could be added and so on. And so for Botswana, the diamond, which may be a want for people in Antwerp, may well be a need for the communities on the ground who are benefiting from the diamond mining. So some of my work has tried to push that back as well. And the issue is then we have to raise it to the next level in terms of sustainability also, is what is it there's another whole area of research that has been developing in environmental discourse, which is around the quality of life, or what we call well-being. What are indicators of well-being? And this is also where sometimes the environmentalist community misses the mark, because quality of life is often not easily defined just in terms of how much you may want to be able to have health and environmental assurances, but often it comes about through a sense of reciprocity, of gift giving, of social capital that's generated through that process. And commodities that can provide meaning in that kind of transference are very powerful. And that's where gems come in as well, because gemstones convey that, and they do add value in quality of life indicators. And there is research in psychology which suggests that, and that's what I've tried to suggest in the second point on the slide, is that there is enough research which shows that celebrations, milestones, holidays, all of these, when they're linked to gift giving, they have a very potent influence. So the research in environmental psychology, if we really go and look into it deeper, suggests that this is a very important way in which the industry should pitch itself, because you are increasing that quality of life. And this is true of whatever socioeconomic stratum you might be at. Even people who may not be able to afford the 4-carat diamond, they may find value in giving some other much less costly gift which may be embodied within something like gemstones. And then gemstones bring an additional aspect to that sense because they have a permanence. And that is the other aspect that the environmentalist movement has, I think, missed when we think about sustainable livelihoods, is that gemstones, because of their very nature, despite the topaz crystal which exploded in water that we heard, they are relatively permanent, right? We heard from Dr. Lickberg that his topaz crystal exploded in Ukraine. So, you know, there is that permanence which is very important, right? And so that permanence from an environmental gift-giving perspective is also a very positive thing, because this is one of, even if you use those indicators of environmental impact, if you have a gift which has greater transference, which can go on for generations actually, it has a lower ecological footprint. Right? So I think this is one aspect of the gemstones arena which needs to be better marketed in order for you to be able to realize some of the consumer benefits from the green marketing sector as well, which is, I think, sometimes often missed. And often when I talk to my students, I'm giving, you know, I teach a course on Earth System Science and Policy, and there are always some students in the audience who say, well, I really feel bad about buying stones or, you know, getting these consumer luxury goods because of that aspect. And I think this kind of messaging is really important to convey. So I call it sort of the joy of jewels. Permanence of the gift rather than perishable items. The other aspect, very important, is to convey this wealth transfer from rich to poor countries, which is not as directly put forward. We are trying to do that now in terms of some of the work at the University of Delaware, which you may have heard about, our Jewelry Development Impact Index that we're developing with also in concert with the US State Department and other entities. That is one way in which one can think about that. But it's really important for us to consider this transfer of wealth that comes about because of the geological determination of where gemstones come from, and particularly because the storyline around gemstones is where the provenance and the value is often created. And we heard, you know, about how gem labs themselves don't like to value stones, but of course the reality is that origin determination does create value. And if we are able to include in that storyline a storyline about poverty alleviation, about social development, I believe you will make a difference. Now, I remember I've been in this community in different ways, and I have met with many field gemologists and others, and I am not a gemologist myself, so I must approach this with humility. And there will be always some pushback, and people will say, well, no, the real buyers of high-value stones, they don't really care. They just want that the stone should look good. I would really say that consumer tastes are going to change if they haven't done so already. And I would say you better be prepared for that rather than being entrenched in this worldview that no, the Colombian emeralds will always be the most valuable. The storyline is going to determine a lot of changes, as you will see. And it may well be that Colombian emeralds deserve to be because of a storyline which is very important in these terms, because it's an opportunity for a post-conflict country to rebuild certain areas of where there was destruction caused by civil conflict, and hence now this could be a mechanism for social development. That storyline really should come through much more in terms of your marketing. It does not currently. Unfortunately, it does not. If anything, it comes through the other way around. If there's negative publicity, you do damage control, which is the way the Kimberley process has basically operated, right? It's a damage control mechanism. It's not really a mechanism of saying, let's showcase what is positive. The only little bit I've seen that my other country of citizenship is Australia, and we did have Rio Tinto at one time, saying they have got the, Argyle diamonds had this value that they were benefiting Aboriginal communities, but hardly, very little in the larger domain. And that's an area, I think, which deserves far more attention. So I would say this issue of origin, it has been underutilized in your repertoire of trying to market your stones, because there is a bravado. The field gemologists, I've spent time with, people with GIA affiliation like Vincent Pardue and others. They are amazing individuals. The maverick aura around them is just phenomenal. And then there's a certain level of inability to consider different ways or mechanisms sometimes which comes with that. And so I have great respect for all of the work that you do across the supply chain, but be willing to consider some of these narratives. Just as I am being humble, I hope you will as well in the same light, because I interact with young people on a daily basis in the university setting, and I'm telling you, things are going to change. So please get out of the bubble, all right? So, some of these areas, the jewelry jitters that are there, of course, we know these are the kinds of things which students are telling me, and you're all too familiar with. The gaping hole at Kimberley is often put forward. Some might say it's really beautiful, of course, but then you have things that happen, like the Marikana tragedy in South Africa. Some of you may know that, mining especially gets brought up at the level of discourse where you may not even realize. So, for example, there was a very famous book written a few years ago called Inequality. Did anyone come across that? By Thomas Piketty? Piketty's famous book called Inequality is like a 600-page tome. It was on he was on CNN and Forbes and this and that and the other. So anyhow, he's a French economist, and he came up with this book on inequality. The first paragraph in that book, this is a book about inequality in the world, right? And it's a tome, and the guy is being, revered and reviled all over the world. The first paragraph in that book starts in Marikana. How many of you know Marikana? What happened there? Okay, Marikana was, one person. It's not a gemstone area, it's platinum, but still, it's related to your sector, right? So this was the tragedy that happened in South Africa in terms of the labor dispute and all those miners who were killed, right? In South Africa, about, 5 years ago. So the book, which is, being celebrated, first paragraph is, look, mining is tantamount to inequality, and that's how it starts. So, this is what we're dealing with up front, and we have to confront how do we address this issue. How do we do it well? Sourcing from local companies, artisanal miners and small-scale miners being considered, that's a question which is often asked because especially your sector, in the gemstone sector, I get different figures. Some people say 75%, some say 80%. I don't know how people actually collect the data because it's a bit tricky how you're able to get it, but it's a large percentage of stones come from artisanal and small-scale mining overall. And this is unusual in terms of mining more broadly. Gold is also interesting in that way, but it's not a majority of gold. But with gemstones, we know for a fact that majority of gemstones come from artisanal and small-scale sources. So we need to figure out also how that can be leveraged, because that's another area which gets a lot of criticism in the same way because of the same levels of governance issues. And we'll have, I'm sure, a great presentation later by Christina around that sector particularly as well. So another way in which you need to consider what are the mechanisms whereby that social and environmental performance issue can be further developed. Value adding, of course. Where is that value being added? This is one of the questions the students often tell me. The middle people take all the money, right? So, I mean, some would argue a lot of us are middle people in some form or another. And how do you make the argument that the middle people are actually adding value and not just aggrandizing value from the poor miner who is languishing in the pit? It's a huge issue to bring forward. And there are long-term, family networks, established areas of hierarchy, market-dominant minorities. There's this hugely complex social net that underpins that. And how we are able to figure that out and be able to create the case for that kind of social development impact, enormously important. Diversification after the rush. This is another issue which is often brought up. We all know about what happens when there's a sudden deposit that's found. How do you move beyond the rush? And that whole area of research and inquiry beyond the rush phenomenon deserves much greater attention. We're beginning to do much better with it. We've learned from some of the mistakes in places like Ilakaka and Madagascar, where there were these massive rushes leading to massive levels of ecological destruction as well as other social problems. So there is a recognition slowly, but we have to keep this on the radar. And as we develop metrics of performance, we'll see that that's going to come up again. How do you deal with the rush phenomenon? Because you need governance mechanisms to plan for rushes. Linkage with conflict of lootable resources. Because of the size of gemstones, this will be a constant challenge, the lootability question. And some of this will be solved by technology in terms of how well we are able to figure out how to prevent that kind of dynamic. And of course, the large-scale diamond mining companies have developed very detailed ways in which they track their own employees in terms of not looting diamonds from the mine. So there are ways to do it. It's a matter of how we can upscale that to other contexts. And then, finally, there is the broad issue of occupational health and educational opportunity for across the supply chain. And this is one of the areas where AGTA has been working quite a bit with us in the Gem Hub with regard to the issue of dust and respiratory and pulmonary exposure. But across that, there's occupational health, there's also environmental health concerns. Some of these may seem minor compared to like gold mining and cyanide, but they can be, for those particular communities, still significant. And so how do we address those in a systematic way moving forward? I think that last one, actually, probably we have come very close to solving many of those problems, but we still have the environmental side, which is still a huge challenge. And I'm going to bring that up later, the environmental remediation aspect of the mining that happens. So, just to sum it up, we've got the small-scale artisanal sourcing of stones and the supply chain being diffuse. We have the provenance issue and the determination of highly dependent, the high level of dependence we have on labs, which needs to be reframed in a way to make your storyline a bit more useful to the consumer. And that will also help with consumer awareness and compliance assurance. And then I put in this bit at the end also around the synthetic versus mined gemstones, because that ties in to some degree with the second point. And that is that the synthetic stones, there will be definitely a place for them. But then the storyline aspect is going to be more difficult in the synthetic stone sector to communicate in terms of the social development side. But what the synthetic stone sector can do also, if there's a complementarity with the mined stone sector, is that they can oftentimes provide a better storyline on the environmental side, though not always. It depends, and there's still ongoing research around that, like how much energy is used to mine a stone versus to have a synthetic stone produced. There are techniques we can use, which I'll mention later, that can be operationalized. So on the environmental side, it's easier to make the case for synthetics, often less so on the social development side and livelihood side, number of jobs created and so on. So potential solutions. Clearly on the social and ecological side, we have tools. One tool is called lifecycle analysis. How many of you are familiar with LCA? Okay, a few of you may have heard of it. So this is a tool that developed out of the field of industrial ecology. That's a discipline that evolved in the 80s to look at the full life, sort of cradle to cradle approaches of looking at commodities that are used. How do we measure impacts across the entire life of that particular commodity, and cradle to cradle, saying that hopefully you'll recycle it rather than have cradle to grave, which is the old way. You know, you're trying to keep everything out of the grave as much as you can. So LCA traditionally was done on energy issues, energy usage, and ecological impact, but now there is a whole field of LCA that has developed called social LCA. And that looks at employment impact, livelihood impacts of various kinds. So social LCA should be utilized much more so, I think, for the gemstone sector, because you can make a great case for social LCA in your field. The environmental LCA is more difficult. That's where the synthetic crowd wins out, because the environmental LCA, energy usage, land use impacts, greenhouse gas emissions, all that's going to get usually better for synthetics. But for the social side, so maybe that's where you find the happy balance between synthetics and mind, right? The synthetics can have the ecological benefits and the mind can have the social benefits. But ideally, you would want some convergence in there as well. Now, the other thing I should mention is also on the ecological side, because it is such a problem, there have been some ideas presented. And one particular one is this idea of conservation gemstones that some of you may have heard of, that was presented by Vincent Pardue and Laurent Cartier some years ago. They wrote a little article on my blog on the National Geographic site. I'm very fortunate to have this affiliation with National Geographic, and they provide me a little online blog. And so I invited them to write this piece on that. You can view it if you like. It's online. If you just Google conservation gemstones and Pardue and Cartier, it'll come up. But the idea is basically that gemstones, the provenance is so important, and especially stones which are close to conservation areas. Like, of course, in Kenya, you have Savarite, which is close to a national park. Very important area. That's clearly a conservation gemstone, that each time you have a sale of that stone, a certain amount of royalty accrues, and now we have great accounting systems whereby we could do this, and it goes into a fund which promotes conservation in that area. And it could be managed by an entity like the Global Environmental Facility or through the UN Environment, or there are so many different mechanisms in the international system to monitor that. One of my other hats I wear is I serve on the United Nations International Resource Panel, and this is an area the resource panel is very interested in, around mineral governance issues. And so I'm sure we could find an entity to monitor that kind of mechanism. But that would really create a great way to deal with this big problem we have of restoration of gemstone mines. Because unlike large-scale mines, there isn't really either the resource base or the incentives for, once the mining happens, to be able to remediate it. So the larger companies like Gemfields, of course, that may be part of their licensing arrangement, but for the small scale mines, it's very difficult. So we have to think about how we could make that work. I think it's a great idea, and one which deserves more attention, because again, as I mentioned earlier, gemstones are resold, they're recycled, so to speak, reused, and there's great potential in that as well. Finally, I know much has been said about blockchain in the previous session, very well presented by our friends at Google, but I wanted to note that this is an area, it's again one which has come under a lot of criticism within the GEMS community as being, perhaps over-marketed. But what we have tried to do is that I think there's a lot of benefit in looking at blockchain from a chain of custody perspective, but of course, making sure we are aware of the pitfalls. And we are very conscious of the pitfalls. So we have published an article, Laurent Cartier, myself, and colleague in Switzerland, we have worked on this article on blockchain, and it's just come out in the Journal of Gemology if you're interested. But we see this as a potential mechanism for operationalizing a lot of the other ideas I have mentioned, but noting that there is going to be some pitfalls. So it's not a panacea, but it provides some new opportunities for us to consider. Finally, a call to arms as a professor. The book is my weapon, and education is really important. It seems cliched, but there's a reason why education is often linked to so many other indicators in terms of gender empowerment, in terms of overall health development indicators. So education, beyond any doubt, at the level of the minds and all across, is going to be very significant. And this is where we are trying to do our part. Some of you have already met my colleague Pat Seavrud, and she's got a great poster out here, and she's former GIA staff member too, so many of you know her. But I would urge you to consider what we're trying to do in this area is developing a brand new initiative on minerals, materials, and society, which will allow us to really interface with some of these kinds of problems, and we'll have a very unique model. We'll have an online learning model, we'll have field experiential learning like our field gemology colleagues are doing, and we'll have intensive on-campus programs which cater to the kind of needs of professionals. So definitely keep that in mind, and we will definitely be trying to collaborate and not compete, because we realize it's a small talent pool which may be interested in these kinds of activities. So definitely keep us posted on that. So I'll end with this photograph just as a reflection, that this is a photograph from lapidary in Sri Lanka, which I took many years ago. And I remember when I showed it to my students, one of them like, how old are those kids? That's the first question they asked, rather than saying like, oh, wow, isn't it great that youth are being employed? So it's just one photograph, but it's the same problem. Like, immediately perception of one is one way and the other is the other way. Like, so youth empowerment versus child labor. So with that, I'll conclude and open it up for questions. Thank you. Questions, comments, critiques? There's one here. I think, do we need a mic? Or? Yes, please.
Hello, Dr. Ali. I have a question. This is about balance, sustainability in terms of the social environment, and I forgot the third
Economics.
Mm-hmm. Where do you draw the balance in terms of miners in a lot of third world countries? I'm from Sierra Leone. In trying to not only sustain the environment, but also how families can feed their themselves, and things we are worried about, like destroying the land, but the immediate needs of artisanal miners and those that how do you balance that in your discourse that you were like?
Yes, no, I mean, what I'm arguing is that the economic side is going to be forefront. So immediately people see That's what happens at mineral rushes. But if you do not consider the social and the environmental, the long-term viability becomes problematic. So it becomes a question of time, right? So that is why the artisanal miners increasingly are recognizing some aspects of the social side, at least. The environmental is still more difficult for them to recognize because they are itinerant often. They move from one area to another. And so that they do not have any vested interest in restoring the land after they have left. And that's why I was mentioning this conservation gemstones idea is really very effective. Or you have to get the government to fill in that. It's the classic externality, as economists call it, where the economic benefits are accrued by one, but the economic costs are not accrued by the same. So, that cost will be on the agrarian farmer or someone else who won't be able to grow any crops there because there are holes everywhere, So that's where either you have to get a government mechanism or you set up a system like what I was suggesting. But I am totally for the livelihoods improvement of the miner. That has to be absolutely a core way by which you market the industry too. Yes, please, yep.
Thank you. You mentioned the pitfalls for the blockchains, and I agree there are many hurdles and many issues, much more than one single head like mine can think of. Are you happy to share the pitfalls you're aware of to make the blockchain be more useful, more powerful?
Yes, yeah. So I think we need, right now we're in a field testing mode. One of my other roles is I'm on the board of the Diamond Development Initiative, which some of you may be familiar with, the nonprofit that was set up to, monitor some of the development impacts of mining. It's based in Canada. So the DDI is now partnering with De Beers on this. The first time they're going to try and use technologies to be able to track certified artisanally mined diamonds, and they're field testing it in Sierra Leone. That will be a good way for us to see the biggest pitfall criticism people will say is that when you take the photograph of the diamond when it's coming out or whatever stone coming out of the side, can it be doctored? Can someone else come in and actually put in? So it's garbage in, garbage out, as you know. So if somehow the photograph going in is doctored as well as the material then going forward all the way, that can be a problem. Basically, how do you provide those mechanisms whereby, because it is such an assurance-oriented mechanism, if you get the wrong information in, by wrong not in the way that the lady who asked you the question in the previous session, that where there's an error, but where there's deliberately wrong information added, then how do you make sure that that can be accounted for? So I think that's the main challenge, but otherwise the actual process and the fact that it is so indelible, that's a very positive thing, absolutely. Yes, please.
I have my own personal runner. So is there a methodology in place already for coaching or teaching the miners about blockchain and how to take them to this?
Well, this field test over the next 4 to 5 months is going to be very important because this is the first time that it is actually being implemented in Sierra Leone. We have, DDI developed this artisanal diamond mining standard, which they have, and that standard is being used in terms of, and the standard includes social development indicators, environmental issues, all those factors as well. So, in terms of what is being done with the miners, we are going through a training program with them right now, and it's being worked on with the government of Sierra Leone, so it will be definitely, I want to hold judgment on it until we have the output from that field testing. It's a sort of a prototyping, and I believe we should have some publicly available data around how well the key issue is how well the miners will uptake it, how well it's going to be, and how well the diamonds will sell. Will there be consumer level of confidence in them? And we'll know in about 6 months. So stay tuned. Yes, please. Over there, please, yes.
For blockchain to work, how do you expect the for a true blockchain to work, the supply side coming from the mine is rough. It's being then, the parcels are then being sold off to cutters. And that product changes its complexion totally. It's my experience that cutters are not going to be as interested in seeing the blockchain go forward. What is your opinion?
Yes, no, I mean, I think, there has to be, the main issue is in terms of where it is coming from at the mining level. Right now, that is the main aspect of it. So by the time it gets to the cutters, hopefully if there is that gatekeeping role there, then beyond that, it is not as consequential. So, that's what they're aiming towards, is that if you can get that part where you have the biggest concern in terms of the environmental and social performance further down the supply chain, then by the time it reaches the cutters, then you've been able to take care of any problems that may have happened as a result. So definitely your point is well taken, but the goal is really to make sure it's more further down the supply chain. So, okay, I think we should wrap up then. Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you. Pleasure.